What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit the like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now if you ever so you never miss another sit down video. If you're listening to us currently on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Podcasts, welcome in. We always appreciate you being here as well. If you enjoy the audio, please make sure you leave us a 5-star review and rating. It goes a long way. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? We are back. This is episode 124 of the Sit Down, and I am your host, Jeff Nadu. Now, if you're watching us currently on YouTube, you might notice that my video is not working today. That is, I'm having some issues with my camera. I'm going to hopefully get that figured out by the end of the week. But I've noticed in some of the live videos, some of the signal isn't great. So you don't get to see my gleaming face today. Now, if you're on audio, you never get to see my face, which is probably good for you. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we have another great show as always. And I've been looking forward to doing this one for a while, at least personally. Today, we're going to talk about a very interesting individual, a guy who really is one of the more powerful people in the history of the Gambino crime family. We obviously hear a lot about John Gotti and Paul Castellano, but we don't hear that much about Joe N Gallo. No, not crazy Joe Gallo, Joe N Gallo. What you'll learn by the end of the show is that really, when you look at the history of the family, Joe N Gallo was the consigliere for over 20 years. He made millions of dollars in multiple different rackets. He was very close to Carlo Gambino. And like a lot of his old emissaries in the family in the late 80s, he had to be a pragmatist. He had to essentially go on with what was done and accept it, regardless of his associations. The story of Joe N Gallo next on the sit down. And before we do that, I want to tell you about one of our presenting sponsors. It's the great folks at mybookie.ag. Now, football season is here, guys. Many of you know that. The NFL is in full force. College football's been going. You got baseball playoffs coming up. There's no better place to go and wager and get involved with casino action than mybookie.ag. I mean, we've all been there before, right? You want to go to the casino, but real life calls and you can't get there. Well, sports betting, online casino, MyBookie's new and improved casino is here and ready to change the game. You can dive into truly realistic casino experiences that provide you a real life Las Vegas experience. You get the latest in slots, jackpots, live dealer action, blackjack, roulette, whatever you want to do, they got you covered. They got plenty of brand new high end games for real cash rewards. Now, just for listening or viewing the show, you can start your adventure right now at MyBookie Casino and Sportsbook with a generous sign-up bonus. By listening to us, if you use promo code SITDOWN, all one word, that's promo code SITDOWN, when you open your account, you get to secure yourself with a nice 50% match on deposit. So if you deposit $500, they're going to give you $250 right out of the gate. Again, promo code SITDOWN. And that's not all, because their revamped loyalty program ensures that you'll be showered with rewards. That includes free spins, cashback offers, and VIP perks. The more you play, the more you win. Be like me. Go play anytime, anywhere with the MyBookie Casino and Sportsbook, mybookie.ag. Promo code SITDOWN. Get yourself a deposit bonus. All right, everyone. Well, let's jump into Joe N Gallo. I will say, after the biography on Joe N Gallo, I will talk a little bit about this new podcast coming out. You may have heard about with Joey Molino. If you listen to us on YouTube, you know I've done some content on this. I want to kind of talk about it at the end with some of our audio people. So stick around once the biography is over. But let's get into it. Joe N Gallo on the sit down. Joe N Gallo was born on January 8th, 1912. Now, Joe N Gallo did actually and was actually born in the United States. His family were from Sicily. They were from the area of Bisacchino, which is in Sicily. And I do believe, I'm not sure about this. I sent him a message. He didn't get back to me. I do believe that is also where Mikey Scars is from. In fact, a lot of Gambino people that are from Sicily are from that general vicinity. But Joe N Gallo's parents were from Bisacchino. And it was said that there has been some questions on where Joe N Gallo was actually born. But his family at one point would live for a short time in Scranton, which is a town in Northeast Pennsylvania. Now, there are certain sources that claim that Joe Gallo was born in Alabama. I have been able to verify that. And obviously, I don't know anyone from Joe Gallo's family, but there has been a question as to where Joe Gallo was essentially raised. Now, in his early life, Joe Gallo's parents would move to New York City, and it was said he would settle in and around the East Village after his parents were from Bissaquino. Now, Joe Gallo was by his late 20s delving into criminality, and by the early 30s, Joe Gallo would be convicted of illegal gambling, and that was from an arrest report from when he was arrested in 1966. Now, we don't have any information on what the illegal gambling charge consisted of, but if you know anything about Joe Gallo, he would be connected really early on with a guy called Charles Dungara, who was an old school Gambino member. Charles Dungara had a lot of the East Village on lock and had dice games and Zigonette and all sorts of gambling games. So it could be where Joe Gallo got his early charge. Now, one of the first people Joe Gallo started running around with in the East Village and in Manhattan was a familiar face, a guy who you may have heard of, Joe Piney Armone. Now, Piney and him kind of frequented the area of the East Village and kind of ran around together. Now, Piney had a brother who was nearly 20 years older than him called Stefano Armone. Now, Stefano Armone was called 14th Street Steve. He was a big drug dealer, was a very powerful old school guy in the Gambino crime family, and was pretty important in the general day to day in the East Village with people like Charles Dongara. Now, for Joe N. Gallo, he was pretty active not only in gambling, but also loan sharking and extortion. But as many of you all know, eventually to begin to make real money in the mafia, you have to get into labor racketeering, different higher end rackets. And that's exactly what Joe N. Gallo found his way to. Now, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the garment district because that's exactly where Joe N. Gallo would find some of his early success. The thing about Joe N. Gallo is that people don't realize when it comes to the garment district and the mafia's hold over the garment district for really most of, let's just say, the 10s and 20s, the garment district had the Black Hand involved with it. They had kind of overrun certain labor unions. The Jewish mafia was involved with the garment industry, but Charlie Luciano and Meyer Lansky kind of took hold of the garment industry in the 20s. And that's when it kind of turned into a mob run thing. And that would go on to the 90s. If you've ever heard a lot about Carlo Gambino, his son, Tommy Gambino, ran the garment district for a long period of time. And this is where I think for Joe N. Gallo, he makes a connection that really shapes his life in the mafia. In the 30s and into the 40s, Joe N. Gallo would meet Carlo Gambino, and they had various businesses in the garment district. If you read into Joe N. Gallo, I mean, he had up to 10 or so companies that were involved in the garment district. He had control over certain people that worked there. He had control over all sorts of different things. And he was a full partner in garment companies. He would get manufacturers under his control that would do his subcontracted work. And he took a piece from pretty much everything. Now, Joe N. Gallo had his own company, a company called Y&G Incorporated. And that would allow him to take kind of that major control over it. He would control all sorts of people connected to that. And that's really where he was connected to Carlo Gambino. Now, what that elicits is the mafia, by the end, a lot of the control that they had in the garment district was the Gambino crime family, and it was through people like Joe N. Gallo. Now, in and around 1947, Joe N. Gallo is about 35 years old. He would become a made member in the Gambino crime family. Now, in the same ceremony, he would be made alongside his old friend, Joe Piney Armone. Also at that ceremony made that night was Frankie the Wop Gagliardi. Now, what I found interesting about Gagliardi is I actually know of his name because he was the person, weirdly enough, many years later, when Sammy Gravano was made in the mid 70s, the ceremony that Sammy was made at was actually in the home of Frankie the Wop. And I remember when I interviewed Sammy, he was blown away that I had known that. He was like kind of like taken back that I knew that. But Frankie the Wop goes back to the 40s in the family. Now, one thing about Joe N Gallo is his rise happens pretty quickly. Once Joe N Gallo is made, he is put into the crew of Charles Dongara. Now, a lot of historical references will tell you that Joe N Gallo was at one point part of Stefano Armone's crew. Now, a lot of researchers and historians will tell you that there is no known proof that Stefano Armone was ever a captain in the family, and that a lot of it is just hearsay. What we do know is Joe N Gallo was in the crew of Dongara, and what he would do is he would become essentially Dongara's right hand man. By that point in the 40s and into the 50s, Dongara was born in the 1800s, and he was suffering from, health issues. He had diabetes, so by that point, he was doing a lot of his business. He was going up to his farm up in upstate New York, and Joe would act as his kind of acting capo when he wasn't around. And he really trusted Joe and Gallo, did Charles Dongara. Now, by the late 40s, the family was kind of going an interesting way. At that point, the boss of the family was Vincent Mangano. We all know that, Vincent Mangano would go missing in 1951, and what do we know happens? Albert Anastasia takes control of the Gambino crime family. Now, his underboss is a person called Frank Scalish. And Frank Scalish has kind of a pretty interesting idea, if you will. Obviously, the Gambino crime family is always moving and trying to get hold on different territory. He becomes connected with a Gambino mobster called Luigi Marici. Now, Marici is told by Scalise to travel to Baltimore with his associates and set up shop in Baltimore. And the goal was they wanted to crew the Gambino crime family in Baltimore. And Joe N Gallo, kind of by the 50s, is regarded as the liaison between Baltimore and New York. And due to his relationship with people like Marici, as well as a guy called Frank Corby, that allowed the Gambino crime family to take and expand territory. And what the Gambinos did, people like Frank Corby, is they made Baltimore into a faction under the Gambino tutelage and made a ton of money in the process. Now, what I want to kind of do is go over some of the different members that were all Gambino crime family members, but operated out of Baltimore, and some of the different jobs that they actually had. Now, the quasi capo of the crew was Luigi Marici. Now, Marici was actually from Palermo in Sicily, and he came over, it's kind of unknown when he came over, but he would become a made member of the Gambino crime family. And as I said, was sent to Baltimore by Frank Scalish to kind of organize things down there. He would become the capo and eventually would retire in the late 50s, and Frank Corby would take over his operations. Now, some of the other people involved down there was this guy, Frank Debine. They called him Dunchich. He was from Calabria. And that's one thing that I found interesting about the Baltimore crew is people like Debine were from Calabria, but Luigi Marici was told by Anastasia to, get Calabrians in the crew as well. We want Sicilians and Calabrians. We want to kind of work together on all this. Now, Dunchich, as they called him, was a person who kind of frequented some different places down there. He was a guy who was known as a pretty big racketeer. And what he did is not only trafficked in narcotics, but he was heading bookmaking operations and gambling clubs in Baltimore County. He was also known to have some different nightclubs and things like that as well. Definitely an important character in the underworld. Now, Patsy and Frank Eberly, or not Eberly, Corby. I'm thinking of Patsy Eberly. I'm thinking of two different people. Patsy and Frank Corby were two brothers that ultimately would take over the leadership of the Baltimore crew. They had a bunch of people involved. And when Marici steps down, Frank would take over in the late 50s, and he had a very good relationship with Joe N Gallo. Now, in 1967, Frank Corby was actually shot during an altercation with a mobster from Pittsburgh over a gambling debt, which was kind of interesting. Now, Corby was a pretty big earner as well. He ran a company called the Baltimore Pizza Crust Incorporated, and he had a lot of rackets and things like that. He was a pretty important member, an ultimate capo of the Baltimore crew. A couple other people that were involved in Baltimore: Thomas Reds Aversa. He was a big racketeer, owned a bunch of nightclubs and popular districts in Baltimore City. Benjamin Benny Trotta Magliano, and I bring him up because he's kind of an interesting person. He ran a bunch of fight and boxing operations in Baltimore. He was also managing different fighters, and you may have heard of Benny Trotta due to an interesting political connection. It was said that Nancy Pelosi's father, we all know who Nancy Pelosi is, her father, a person called Thomas D'Alessandro, was very close to Benjamin Magliano. If you know anything about Nancy Pelosi, she is from the Baltimore area. And her father was said to be very close with Benny Trotta. Also in the crew was a man called Angelo Manafo. Now, Manafo was kind of an integral part of the Baltimore crew due to the fact that he was close with a guy called Julius the Lord Salisbury. If you know anything about Baltimore history, Julius Salisbury was a huge bookmaker, numbers operator, Jewish guy, and he was partners with Angelo Manafo. And Manafo was essentially running with Salisbury all the numbers and bookmaking activities in and around. They also ran horse books and all sorts of stuff. They were incredibly huge earners. So what the Baltimore crew is it's a bunch of guys who are making money in all sorts of different ways. And they would report to Joe N Gallo. In fact, Joe N Gallo would get out to Baltimore regularly to have talks and discussions and pick up things from the Baltimore crew. Now, obviously, as I said earlier, Albert Anastasia, by this point in the early 50s, had taken over the Gambino crime family. Now, as I said, Joe N Gallo also was part of the Charles D'Angara crew. And he was basically a capo by that point because Charles D'Angara was not around a ton. He was quasi-retired, and D'Angara really respected Joe N Gallo. Now, for most of D'Angara's adult life, or not D'Angara, Joe N Gallo's adult life, he would live in the Murray Hill section of New York City, and not far from the East Village. He lived on East 34th Street, not far from the Queens Midtown Tunnel. Um, Now, we all know that by the late 50s, Carlo Gambino would engineer the assassination of Albert Anastasia and take over the Gambino crime family. And his long-standing ties way back to the Garment District with Joe N Gallo really helped Joe N Gallo rise quickly in the family. But it wouldn't be right away. Gambino had a pretty decent group of guys in general in control. Once Gambino takes over, we kind of know what happens next. He's obviously the capo di tutti capi of not only the family, but of the mafia. His underboss is a guy called Joseph Biondo. And eventually in 1965, Biondo's demoted and Neil Delacroce takes that position. Now, the consigliere in 1957, when Carlo takes over, is Joseph Staten Island Joe Riccobono. He retires in 67, and Joe N Gallo takes his position. Now, Joe N Gallo would be the consigliere for the next 20 or so years. Very lucrative. Now, down in Baltimore, this was a nice cash injection for people like Joe N Gallo and for the Gambino crime family. And the group now was headed by Frank Corby. So by the mid 60s, Joe N Gallo is a consigliere, and he goes from, in less than 20 years, he goes from being a made man to an acting capo that had a bunch of guys under him to the consigliere of Carlo's family. Again, the mafia is all about who you know. And when you know Carlo Gambino, and when you're very trusted, you make money, and you know how to, take people out and hurt people, you're going to be indebted to Carlo Gambino. So Joe N Gallo's life is good. Joe N Gallo would live by this point. He moved most of his operations to Astoria. He would live in this building on Crescent Street in Astoria, a stone's throw away from a luncheonette that he operated. He can be seen here outside his luncheonette on Crescent Street, not far from Broadway in Astoria. Now, he had a couple of trusted associates of his own. They would include Anthony Tony Pepsi Vita, a man who worked in the garment district, Anthony Vanello, who was a liaison for him, as well as one of his main people, his driver, Frankie DiStefano. Now, he would down the road sponsor DiStefano into the Gambino crime family in the 70s, which we'll get to. But I want to talk about one of the real changing moments for not only Joe N Gallo, but for other members of the Gambino crime family. In October of 1966, Joe N Gallo, along with 12 or so high-profile mobsters, are at a restaurant in Rego Park, Queens called La Stella Restaurant. They would be busted by the police and paraded and pushed out in front of reporters. And this is, again, something that they would kind of call something called Little Appalachian. We all know of Little Appalachian after Appalachian, which happened in the late 50s, where a bunch of mobsters were uncovered and they were running for the hills in rural New York. This was a smaller meeting, but what it did is it put the mafia on the front page of the paper, if you will. And it was bad. I mean, whenever you bring attention to yourself, that's never good. You don't ever want to make it known, hey, we're here. Now, alongside of Joe N Gallo at that meeting were some big, heavy hitters. In fact, we can see Joe N Gallo being covered. He's there in the gray. To his right is Joe Colombo. Joe Colombo was at that meeting. Other people that were there included Santo Trafficante Jr., Tommy Aboli, Dominic Alonghi, Carlo Gambino, Mike Miranda, and members of the New Orleans family, including Carlos and Joseph Marcello, as well as Anthony Carolla. So this was pretty bad for the mafia. The La Stella restaurant raid, Little Appalachian, it wasn't good. And again, this puts this on the front page on the TV. I believe TV was back in 1966. Whatever. Either way, it wasn't good for the mafia. In 1973, Charles Dungaro would die of natural causes, and anyone that was in his crew essentially would report directly to either Joe N Gallo or they were placed in other crews. So, the ones that were left, and most of them were just soldiers by this point. Now, I want to talk about Paul Castellano because he takes over, as we know, in 1976 after Carlo Gambino dies. But he is very indebted to Joe N Gallo. He knows how important Joe N Gallo is to the Brigada that they have, and he is retained as consigliere. Joe N Gallo remains. I have to say, in the history of photos involving the mafia, I find this to be one of the more interesting ones. This is just a photo of passing traffic, passing people from the other side of the street of Joe N Gallo. It's, early 80s. Obviously, we could see it's in Grand Mercy, not far from East Village, where Joe Gallo lived for many years. And it's just kind of a quiet photo, right? It's him just standing there with his fingers intertwined. He's got the nice suit on, and he's just watching, And we don't know if there are people to the right of him, but we can see that to his immediate left, there is no one. It's just kind of an interesting photo in October of 1981. And if you're not watching us, I kind of describe the photo so you can understand it. Now, Neil Delacroce, by this point, is the underboss as well. He had been the longtime underboss. Joe N is very powerful. He's making a ton of money. He's very close with not only Baltimore, he has a crew down there, but he's close to Santo Trafficante. He knows Carlos Marcello. He's very close in general. Now, I want to talk about a little bit about some of the people that Joe N Gallo was proposing, because by this point, he is taking on new members of the family. He and Paul Castellano and Nelio Delacroce were making people. Obviously, there's a bunch of big names that were made in the 70s, including John Gotti, Roy DeMeo, Sammy Gravano, Gene Gotti, Greg DePalma, Robert DiBernardo, and then as well as people sponsored uh, by Joe N Gallo, which included his driver, Frank DiStefano, who'd become a made member. And it's also been reported that Tommy Agro was sponsored by Joe N Gallo into the family as well. Now, he and Joe Piney kind of gave the word that Tommy Agro was good people, and Tommy Agro uh, got his button. Now, Tommy Agro is a known lunatic, and I'm sure we'll talk about him at some point. In fact, down the road, when Joe N Gallo gets pinched, it can be heard that one of the main witnesses in the case against Joe N Gallo was Joe Dogs Iannuzzi, who was Tommy Agro's guy. So that didn't bode well for his relationship. And what do we know by the early 80s? The Gambino crime family is one of the most powerful families in New York, led by Castellano. There were powerful people like Joe N Gallo and Jimmy Brown and Joe Piney, and you had upstarts like John Gotti. But what we know is that eventually is a dangerous thing to Paul Castellano, because we realize that John Gotti is putting together a hit squad and is going to take Paul Castellano out. Now, the problem that John had is not getting Frankie DeCicco and all those type of people on board. They were all with it. It was getting the old school guys on board, the Joe Pineys, the Jimmy Browns, the Joe N Gallos. Now, John Gotti could essentially say, well, listen, if Joe N Gallo accepts, he remains my consigliere. Now, I want to talk about an excerpt from Sammy Gravano's book, Underboss, which, look, I don't believe every single word. However, I do find this thing plausible with John Gotti. John Gotti at one point says, what about Joe Piney? And we obviously know that Joe Piney handled a lot of things for Paul, whether it was restaurant unions, entertainment stuff, whatever. John Gotti would tell Gravano and DeCicco, quote, Joe's on the bandwagon with us. And that he says Joe Piney has talked to Joe N Gallo, who is Paul's consigliere. Now, Joe N Gallo is not on the bandwagon, according to long, but he's not going to be part of it. He wants to be a fox, let him. So Joe N Gallo is essentially saying that I don't care if you guys do this. I don't necessarily want you to do it, but I'm not going to make a beef if you do it. Now, Sammy would say that him and Frankie DeCicco wanted to make sure that Joe Piney said what John said he said about Joe Gallo. So we make an appointment with Joe Piney. We tell him to meet us in the basement setup Joe Watts had in his house. And this is Sammy saying this. We want to hear out of his mouth, not John Gotti's mouth, not Angie's mouth. Now, John and Angie were there. We send Joe Watts outside, and Frankie DeCicco says to Joe Piney, do you know what you're here for? Joe Piney would respond with, quote, of course. Now, Frankie DeCicco would then start to ask Joe Piney about Joe N Gallo. And John Gotti would step in and say something, to which DeCicco would respond, please, John, let me do the talking now. He then says to Piney, we understand you have Joe Gallo. Piney would respond, quote, yeah, I spoke to him. He won't be a part of this move. His name can't be mentioned, but he will go along if we take over. Now, Gravano would say that he remembered vividly how DeCicco stared at Joe Piney Armone and asked him how sure he was that Gallo wouldn't tip off Paul, because that's what they had to realize. They would be fine and realize that, hey, Joe N Gallo doesn't care. He says do it and he'll come along. But they couldn't be sure that Joe N Gallo wouldn't tell Paul. They had a long history. Now, Joe Piney would allegedly respond, quote, if he betrays us or backs up 1 inch, I'll kill him. Now, listen to that quote. If he betrays us or backs up 1 inch, I'll kill him. This is not someone Joe Piney met yesterday, last week, last month, or last year. Joe Ponte Armone had known Joe N Gallo for 50 years almost. They had went back to they were kids. They were close. They were compares from young. It wasn't easy, but Joe Ponte was Cosa Nostra. And if the other way was around, Joe and Gallo would probably say the same thing. Yeah, he's my guy, but if you don't go along with us, he's dead. And that was that. But I don't think we realize a lot of people called John Gotti stupid or he was bad for the mob, but he was a lot smarter than people think. Him and DeCicco and Gravano and all these people that did this, they realized they couldn't just go off cold cock and kill people. They had to get everyone in the family behind it or trusted behind it. And then they did it. And that was the smart idea. Joey Gallo wasn't some soldier. This guy was a huge earner. He was a huge part of the family. Now, once Paul Castellano was taken out and John Gotti takes over, he retains Joe N Gallo as his consigliere. As we know, it wouldn't last long because I'll talk about the fact that Joe N Gallo would go to prison. But once John Gotti has Castellano murdered, Joe N Gallo's consigliere, Frankie DeCicco is underboss. Now, that would be till he's killed in 1986, to which Joe Ponte takes over as underboss. So let's go to 1986, and let's kind of wrap up here. Now, by this point, Joe N Gallo's pretty old. I mean, he's in his 70s. He realizes that he needs to start setting up someone to kind of take over his rackets, to which his son, Joe C. Gallo Jr., is out of prison. Now, Joe C. Gallo did about 10 plus years for drug dealing, and he goes up to Attica and gets out. And Joe N Gallo realizes, hey, I got to institute my son. I'll put him in control of the garment rackets and teach him the business. And I'm sure I'm going to get arrested at some point anyway, so I got to do what I got to do. Now, Joe N Gallo set him up pretty good. Problem is, in 1987, after being arrested for racketeering and bribery, as well as RICO, Joe Ponte would have to face the fact that he may actually die in prison. Also arrested in the same indictment, Joe Ponte Armone, Jimmy Brown, and other members of the Gambino crime family. Ultimately, Joe N Gallo would be hit with 10 years in prison and would have to report several months later. Joe N Gallo would be released in early 1995 and would die on September 1st, 1995 at the age of 83. It probably wasn't easy. Now, remember, during his life, about 10 years previously, Joe Gallo had a heart attack. It probably wasn't simple for Joe Gallo to go to prison in his late 70s. The government hit him hard, and I guess he was lucky in one level. He didn't die there, but he would die shortly thereafter. Now, his son, Joseph C. Gallo, would run parts of the garment district for a while. He was regularly around people like Tommy Gambino. And according to a investigation by the SCI in New York, it would reveal that by 1995, Joe N Gallo and Joe C. Gallo controlled or owned 5 garment-related companies in New Jersey. And according to the great folks at NewYorkMafia.com, they were the Tony Linda Productions Incorporated, Randello Enterprises, 1040 Grand Street Associates, FLP Distributing Services, as well as Railroad Enterprises Incorporated. And all of the above companies were either in Hoboken or Ridgefield, New Jersey. Now, they didn't all do garment businesses, but they were just various contracting places. And those companies between 1986 and 1988 received 94% of their business from one single garment manufacturer, a place called Norton McNaughton. Now, it would be found out that Norton McNaughton would have resisted unionization in its shipping department, as well as any other contracting firms that it learned. And one of the people that worked and was employed there at this place, Tony Linda, which dealt with Norton McNaughton, was Joe C. Gallo. Now, according to the same investigation between 1986 and 1988, the five Gallo firms got a whopping almost $13 million in revenue, of which about 12 million came from Norton McNaughton. And the Gallo family made about $800,000. So they all lived pretty well. All the people that were involved lived pretty well. And Joe C. Gallo's associate, Leonard Tagliavia, he made a nice yearly salary of over $100,000. He was paid almost 361 grand over 3 years. So he made about 120K a year. So after Joe Gallo's death, his son was still very much a part of the not only Gambino crime family, but the garment district. So we've learned in recent years, Joe C. Gallo has kind of not been around much. We haven't heard much from him. He hasn't faced any legal issues, but he was set up pretty well, and he made a bunch of money in the old school garment rackets in New York. Now, the today garment district, there's not a lot of mob involvement, and that's a lot of these places in New York. The Fulton Fish Market had a bunch of mob involvement many years ago, but it doesn't now. A lot of these places do a good job of stamping out corruption and the mafia. But when we look back at Joe N. Gallo, he is a powerhouse. He was a powerhouse. He spent a couple of years of his life in prison, but not long. He made millions of dollars, set his life up, his family up for years to come, allowed his son to be a very rich man, was one of the most powerful people in the heyday of the Gambino family, 60s, 70s, into the 80s. He saw a bunch of things. He was, again, a powerhouse in no other way. He was respected by everybody from John Gotti to Paul Castellano to Carlo Gambino. And he won't get the name or recognition that he deserves, but he was a very important piece to what the Gambino family did. It's just that simple. Boy, if you could interview someone like Joe N. Gallo, wouldn't it be interesting to hear him just tell stories? All the people we talk about, it would be fascinating. But in a way, that's kind of why we're here a little bit. Maybe we can relive some of these stories and tell you some of the stories of these kind of people, these people that built this country, certain criminal elements or non-criminal elements. And remember, I mean, Joe N. Gallo was a guy who was very involved with, a 20, 30-year run in a different city. Now, you're probably wondering whatever happened to the Baltimore crew of the Gambino crime family. Well, it wouldn't last for too much longer into the 80s. Today, the Baltimore crew is said to be defunct and extinct. For them, um, Frank Corby would assume the role, as I said, but most of the leadership and membership by the 80s had either died or retired. And with Corby being inactive after being shot, the regime was essentially extinct. Frank Corby would die in 1990. Today, there is no known mafia in Baltimore. The only criminality we know of are different black gangs and groups like that, which we obviously saw in shows like The Wire. But if you go to Little Italy in Baltimore today, there aren't any wise guys walking around. It's just that simple. But there you go. Joe N. Gallo, a powerhouse, a person that I'd wanted to talk about for a while, and I'm glad we were able to do it. Before I go, and I'm sure if you're watching on video, you may or may not listen to this, but I did want to talk a little bit on audio about this new podcast with Joey Molino. It's going to be interesting. Obviously, they're not going to sit there and talk about Joey's time as a member of the mafia, but I do think it's going to be interesting. I've posted the links. I've kind of broke the story, if you will, and it's nice to kind of be in correspondence with some of the guys associated with it. A lot of good people behind it as well. Kevin Connolly and Action Park Media. They've got a great host and one of my friends, Joe Perry. I think Joey's going to be a natural. I've seen some of the early stuff they've done. He really is good with this sort of thing. And I think it's going to be incredibly interesting. There'll be a lot of stories, I'm sure, different gambling haunts and different things that he's seen over the years. They'll talk current events, talk about news, they'll talk about cigars and restaurants and travel. I think it's going to be fun. I think you're going to have some great guests. I think you're really going to kind of enjoy what they're doing. I've kind of gotten a picture into what the show is going to be like, and I think it's going to be super, super, super interesting. So what I'll do is make sure you follow me on Twitter at Sitdown Crime Pod. We'll make sure we get some information out for you and where you can find it. If you're not on YouTube, I've posted about it. I posted the link and stuff. Make sure you check it out. I think you guys will all really enjoy it. So make sure you go and check that out. But that's the show for this week. Joe N Gallo. Not real long, which I like. I like to, if we can, I like to keep these between, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, maybe an hour at most. So I'm happy to do that. Next week, I will announce now we have a great interview coming out. It is a former associate of the mafia. So be excited. I'm sure you guys are all going to like it. This guy really hasn't talked to anybody, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm always making new connections, which is exciting. So stay tuned for a great interview next week. That's something you can keep your eye on. I hope everybody's having some success early in football. I'm glad you guys are, um, having success there. If you are, knock on wood or not, make sure you go check out my bookie. Get yourself a promo code, sit down. But that's that for this week. As always, make sure you show us love, share. If you know someone that might like the show, make sure you tell them about it. But until next time, we are out of here. I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.